The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, was the brutal attack committed by the Japanese on the U.S.'s naval base and its fleet. The next day, war was declared in Japan, and the fighting mainly started in the Pacific. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers took off for the capital city of Tokyo to bomb the city. Taking off from the USS Hornet, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led the fleet of 16 planes to Tokyo. This raid was known after as the Doolittle Raid. The raid, although causing little damage to Tokyo, showed that Americans could reach the Japanese mainland and get a sort of a revenge for attacking Pearl Harbor. The planes, running out of gas, all crashed in China except for one plane into the Soviet Union. 70 out of the 80 airmen total from the raid survived and made their way back to the United States. The Japanese now wanted revenge on the Americans, so the heads of the Japanese military authorized the attack on the Midway Islands. The Coral Sea is located on Australia's northeast coast and Papua New Guinea's southeast coast. Japan was attempting to take control of the sea with an invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea. This battle, which took from May 4th to May 8, 1942, was the first air-sea battle in history. When the Japanese landed in the area, they came under attack from both the Australians and the Americans. Planes were rapidly taking off from the American aircraft carrier and attacking the Axis tower, which helped provide a strategic victory for the Allies. The Battle of Midway was a fierce naval and air battle that was fought over the Pacific near the Midway Islands. The U.S. had control of the Midway Islands, and Japan was planning to take them over. The U.S. had broken the Japanese code and found out when and where an attack would take place, so they had time to come up with their own plan. The fighting was between June 4th and June 7th, with the U.S. outnumbered nearly 2-1 in terms of ships and aircraft. Even though the U.S. was outnumbered, they were able to sink all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers, sink 1 cruiser, destroyed 228 planes, and kill 3,000. Japan's initial goal of taking over the Midway Island was not accomplished, and neither was taking out the U.S.'s aircraft carriers. Only one was sunk, the USS Yorktown. This battle was seen as a turning point in the war in America's favor. The USS Enterprise has been a great resource for the U.S. throughout the war so far, and she is really tested at the Battle of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is part of the Solomon Islands and is full of jungles. The Solomon Islands are 1,200 miles off the coast of Australia and near shipping lanes for down under. As they said, if you control the Solomons, you controlled the war. Guadalcanal was part of the land that was taken over by the Japanese, and it was an important base for them. On August 7, 1942, the USS Enterprise reaches Guadalcanal and launches its Wildcat fighters. Soon after the Wildcats launch, the U.S. Marines pour onto the beach in the island, where they will stay for the next 3 months of battle. The Japanese, not being prepared for the attack, have their airfield taken over by morning. This victory is what decides the release of the Enterprise back out to sea. The Marines on land fight with Japanese in the island's jungle environments, which teaches them a lot about fighting in a jungle setting. One important unit of Marines in Guadalcanal in every assault the Marines were involved in World War II were the Navajo code speakers. These Native Americans used their native language to code messages from place to place. The Japanese never broke this code, and these true Americans helped win the war. While the Enterprise was out at sea, the American fleet anchored around Guadalcanal was attacked and almost completely destroyed. The surviving ships fled out to sea. On August 21st, the USS Enterprise back at Guadalcanal was attacked and directly hit by 3 bombs and completely out of battle and in need of repair. It sailed back to Pearl Harbor to get those much-needed repairs. On November 13th, Japan's force arrives at Guadalcanal and pours into the American ships for hours. The next morning, the Enterprise arrives back from Pearl Harbor and attacks the Japanese fleet and utterly destroys it, along with the help of the U.S. Wildcats. On November 15th, the Americans celebrate as the hope of a Japanese victory dies. For the rest of the winter, the U.S. pushes the last of the Japanese off the island. Island hopping was a famous tactic used by the U.S. during World War II to slowly take away Japan's power in the West Pacific. The Battle of Kolygi is a key battle that really started the American movement towards Japan by island hopping. The Battle of Kolygian was fought between January 31st and February 3rd, 1944. Kolygian is also an atoll like Tarawa and also in Japan's control. The United States wanted to really trying to get to Japan, the mainland, but they did not have the resources right away to get there. The goal of the battle was to destroy air and sea defense lines of the Japanese in the Pacific. The U.S. came in fierce with 42,000 men. The Japanese were unprepared, vastly outnumbered, and poorly trained. After only 4 days of fighting on the island, 230 of the original 8,100 Japanese soldiers still stood. On February 3rd, the island is officially captured by the Americans. The next major battle in island hopping was the Battle of Saipan. Saipan is the largest of the Mariana Islands and is also controlled by the Japanese. The Americans wanted Saipan, so they attacked a week after D-Day on June 15, 1944. The Japanese are prepared and putting up a good fight for 3 weeks. But after 3 weeks, the Japanese could not resupply, so they are overcome. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and even Japanese civilians of Saipan killed themselves instead of being captured. Those who were left were captured. On July 9th, Saipan is officially captured. The Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Toko and his entire war cabinet resigned after the defeat of Saipan. This was the beginning of the end of war in the Pacific. Iwo Jima was the closest island to Japan that the Americans were fighting for yet. The Battle of Iwo Jima was from February 19 to March 26, 1945. The battle was between about 23,000 Japanese soldiers and over 110,000 American soldiers. The Japanese were able to hold firm against the Americans for a few weeks, but even though they are outnumbered this much, they were able to do this because of their preparations in digging systems of bunkers, underground tunnels, and even hidden artillery. But after weeks spans of Japanese being able to hold on, they were losing grip of the rope and could not tie a knot at the end. After one of the fiercest battles in the Pacific, the Americans captured Iwo Jima on March 26. Almost all of the Japanese were either dead or missing. The final island for the U.S. to conquer before reaching the mainland of Japan was Okinawa. Okinawa was first attacked by the Allies on April 1, 1945. Shortly after landing, Allied soldiers encountered strong Japanese resistance. Intense gunfire and shelling gave the battle its nickname, the Typhoon of Steel. After an intense 82 days, the island falls to the Allies. This victory did not come easy, though. It was the bloodiest battle in the Pacific. The Americans lost 12,520 out of their initial 180,000. The Japanese losing 110,000 out of their initial 130,000. It is estimated that between 40,000 and 150,000 of Okinawa's citizens were also killed. This battle was the last major battle in the Pacific War. Less than 2 months later, the bombs were dropped and Japanese surrendered.
Although the atomic bomb was tested just a few weeks earlier, the Secretary of State James Burns urged Truman to use it. This bomb was created through the Manhattan Project, which was formed to secretly build and test atomic bombs. The project was a success, which left President Truman with a major decision on what to do with the bombs. However, he knew that it would mean the loss of many lives, mostly innocent civilians. Americans were wondering if unconditional surrender was worth another 6 or 9 months of bitter fighting. However, using the bomb to end the war quickly would guarantee that the United States could occupy Japan without ever needing help from the Soviets. Plus, the bomb might even intimidate Stalin, so the U.S. can be seen as an even larger world power. The use of the atomic bomb was always the primary option in the summer of 1945. Then, in early August, the United States dropped two of the three available nuclear bombs on Japan. On August 6th at 8:15 a.m. in Hiroshima, the first bomb killed at least 80,000 people. The bomb was named Little Boy and was carried by a plane called the Enola Gay. It also killed thousands in the long term due to radiation poisoning. This brought the death total from 80,000 to at least 90 to 120,000. This bomb had an effect that not even the US government expected. A second bomb 3 days later at Nagasaki took another 60,000 to 80,000 lives. The scene of citizens trying to escape to the outskirts was horrifying. They could not escape the raging fires burning people alive. People were seen slowly dying from visible wounds and things that cannot be seen, like radiation poisoning. Japan formally surrendered on September 2nd. The world has questioned ever since what would have happened without the use of atomic bombs. After the war, the political system of Japan began to crumble. The Japanese population had become unhappy as the Supreme Council had allowed two bombs to be dropped on its own citizens. The leaders of Japan ended up facing war crimes for deciding not to surrender earlier, before the bombs had been dropped. After the bombings, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, otherwise known as the ABCC, came to Nagasaki to research the effects of the bombs on the survivors of them. The ABCC was an organization strictly to conduct research, not to provide medical care. The citizens doubted that any real treatment would come for those that were suffering from the radiation poisoning. Nagasaki had once been a very flourishing city, and then the citizens had been traumatized. The first medical care had come 8 years after the war. After the bombings, the two cities had economies that were reduced to almost nothing. The economy had shifted to becoming government controlled, and Japan's government had since placed a large amount of wealth in the middle class. The effects of the economy had placed Japan equal to the economic powers of Ethiopia and Somalia, which was 40% less than India's economy at the time. The unemployment rate, inflation, and scarcity had skyrocketed and threatened the long-term economy of the country. The extending effects of these bombs can be seen through the food production rates. Throughout the war, the rice production had fallen by almost 2 million metric tons. In 1945, unforeseen circumstances had become prevalent as heavy rainfalls and cold weather reduced the rice harvest by 20% more than had occurred. Post-war, the government had predicted that there would be enough crops for an average caloric intake of 1,325 calories per day. However, once exports to Tokyo had taken place, the average intake was around 800 calories per day. The calories that the average US citizen at the time consumed was around 3,400 calories. This caused many more deaths and problems for Japan that are still unthinkable. The total impact of the two atomic bombs that were dropped had spanned far past the very instant the impacts had occurred. While the cities were destroyed and people having died instantly, the long-reaching effects have arguably been more devastating. The effects of radiation, food scarcity, and economies falling into shambles took lives of the survivors years after the blast had happened. World War II will never be forgotten, and through this, the strategies that the United States took to win the war were vital at the time, and thus the guilt that follows the death toll of the bombs will never be set aside. After the war, the political system of Japan began to crumble. The Japanese population had become unhappy as the Supreme Council had allowed two bombs to be dropped on its own citizens. The leaders of